Today, October 24th, something unprecedented is unfolding in Russia's industrial heartland. For the first time in over 2 decades, a sector long seen as the engine of national stability is beginning to collapse under its own weight. From early morning, regional dispatch centers across Russia reported abrupt cancellations of cargo routes, unexplained halts in rail hubs, and a sudden absence of coordination from central command. But these were not isolated incidents. By midday, it became clear, Russia's once proud railway industry, employing nearly 700,000 workers, is facing a structural breakdown. And behind this collapse stands not just economic mismanagement, but a growing wave of discontent that may have finally reached the Kremlin's doorstep. At the center of this unraveling is Russian Railways, a state-owned behemoth once heralded as the backbone of national logistics and industrial power. But according to sources within the Transport Ministry, the company is now technically insolvent. Mounting operational costs, plummeting freight volumes, and crippling sanctions have hollowed out its revenue streams. Contracts with domestic steel producers have been quietly annulled. Fuel procurement has slowed to a crawl. Entire repair depots in Ekaterinburg, Novosibirsk, and Rostov have been shuttered. The consequence? Trains are idling in open fields, waiting for parts that will never arrive. But it is not just a supply chain crisis. It is a social one. In the past 48 hours, more than 40,000 employees across various departments, mechanics, dispatchers, engineers, station managers, have received notices of unpaid leave or indefinite suspension. And this is only the beginning. Insiders warn that over 300,000 additional workers are at risk of termination before the end of the quarter if emergency state support fails to materialize. The response from the government so far has been muted. A single-line press release issued this morning spoke of temporary optimizations in the industrial logistics segment. But among the workers, there is no ambiguity. What's happening is not optimization. It's collapse. In cities like Omsk and Perm, local trade unions have already declared a state of mobilization, warning that mass protests could erupt if the layoffs continue without compensation. Sources close to these unions suggest that unofficial talks with regional authorities have yielded no clear path forward. The Finance Ministry, facing its own shortfalls, has reportedly blocked a proposed bailout package for Russian railways, citing unsustainable debt levels and international liabilities. This decision, quietly reached late last week, may have set in motion the chain reaction now spreading across the country. But here's what's most alarming: the anger is no longer silent. In worker forums, encrypted messaging groups, and closed-door union assemblies, the language has changed. It is no longer about temporary hardship or patriotic sacrifice. It is about betrayal. The sentiment is raw, personal, and directed not just at bureaucrats or technocrats, but at President Putin himself. For years, the railway workforce was a loyal base, praised in speeches, elevated in propaganda, entrusted with the logistical arteries of war and industry. Now, they say, they are being discarded in silence. And this silence is beginning to fracture. If you're watching this and haven't yet subscribed, now is the time. Because what's emerging in Russia's industrial core is more than an economic failure. It's a revolt in slow motion. And it may have already passed the point of containment. By midday on October 24th, the depth of the crisis had begun to manifest not just in figures and internal reports, but in the visible rhythm of Russian life. Cargo trains sat motionless across the steppes, their containers sealed but unmonitored. Workers gathered outside decommissioned maintenance yards, some still in uniform, others already packing personal tools into cardboard boxes. The silence in these areas, once filled with mechanical clang and the deep grind of freight movement, was heavy with confusion, and something more dangerous: clarity. The belief that this was temporary had already begun to evaporate. The numbers circulating through internal union channels are staggering. At least 180,000 workers from regional operations across Siberia and the Urals have now been classified as redundant pending reassignment, a bureaucratic euphemism that, in practice, means no income, no relocation, and no legal path for appeal. In Moscow, management-level engineers and route strategists received directives to halt expansion plans for the Baikal-Amur and Northern Sea route connections, 2 flagship logistics projects touted as cornerstones of post-sanctions economic strategy. According to confidential communications obtained from industry insiders, these projects have been placed on indefinite hold due to acute insolvency in material logistics. But the unraveling is not limited to steel and fuel. It's institutional. For decades, Russian railways function not just as an employer, but as a parallel ecosystem: housing programs for employees, school subsidies for their children, medical services integrated into local branches. With funding now frozen, these auxiliary systems are vanishing almost overnight. In Krasnoyarsk, multiple families report being evicted from dormitories maintained by the company, some of them with less than a week's notice. In the Far East, a clinic operated by Russian Railways Health Division closed its doors today without announcement, leaving hundreds of families without access to care. This sudden collapse of institutional support has sharpened the political edge of worker frustration. Trade union leaders, who for years maintained a policy of non-confrontation with the state, are now speaking in unfamiliar tones. In a closed assembly earlier today, a senior representative from the Transport Workers' Federation stated that the loyalty of the industrial class should not be taken for granted. That phrase, while carefully worded, is being interpreted by observers as a deliberate signal. For a sector historically aligned with Kremlin policy and wartime logistics, such language marks a significant shift. And it's not only the unions. Regional governors, many of them Kremlin appointees with direct oversight over logistics corridors, are increasingly distancing themselves from the central government's decisions. In Samara, the regional administration published an unusually direct communiqué blaming federal restructuring priorities for the layoffs. In Tyumen, local officials refused to appear at a scheduled public forum on economic stabilization, prompting rumors that they are bracing for unrest. These fractures between Moscow and its provincial instruments suggest that what began as an economic failure is mutating into a political contagion. According to data quietly compiled by security analysts, the potential for unmanaged mass gatherings in affected regions is now rated as high. This does not mean coordinated revolution. It means spontaneous ignition. Workers, deprived of wages, housing, and medical coverage, are now organizing in informal blocks, pooling remaining funds, securing legal representation, and, most critically, sharing information at scale. Encrypted group chats that were once used to coordinate cargo shipments and schedules are now flooded with protest logistics, unofficial strike plans, and raw commentary aimed at the highest levels of power. Yet the central government remains largely silent. The Kremlin's official stance has not changed. The industry is undergoing temporary optimization amid external pressures. No press conference, no public appearance, no emergency legislative session. Just a phrase repeated through state media, increasingly detached from the images spreading across the country, of shuttered facilities, of unsupervised rail yards, of abandoned housing blocks. This cognitive dissonance is driving workers further into the belief that they are not simply overlooked, but deliberately discarded. In this context, Vladimir Putin's absence from the crisis narrative is becoming more conspicuous by the hour. For a president who built much of his domestic legitimacy on the image of industrial strength, the silence around the railway collapse is not just political, it's symbolic. In every layoff notice, in every blocked payment, in every quiet departure from a once busy terminal, the workers are reading a new message, that the system they sustain no longer needs them. And this realization is changing not only their actions, but their alliances. Because underneath this sprawling crisis, something deeper is beginning to stir. A realization that loyalty, once demanded in return for stability, is no longer part of the bargain. And that when a system breaks its pact with those who carried it, those workers may no longer feel bound by silence. This isn't just an industrial emergency. It's a structural shift in the psychology of a nation's labor force. And while Moscow may still believe it can contain the consequences, the tempo of discontent is accelerating. One corridor at a time. One city at a time. One worker at a time. But the most consequential shift was not happening in the boardrooms of Russian railways or the sealed offices of regional governors, it was taking place in the minds of those who had, until now, held the system together. In city after city, workers long conditioned to obedience were beginning to act without waiting for instructions. Informal assemblies formed outside deactivated rail yards. Small groups of mechanics and engineers, some with more than 20 years of uninterrupted service, began documenting the closures, photographing abandoned locomotives, and uploading internal memos to anonymous channels. The digital trail left behind was not chaotic, it was methodical, as if those inside the machine had begun turning its gears in reverse. What makes this moment different is not just the scale of economic collapse. It is the collapse of narrative. For years, the Russian state had relied on the railway sector as a model of order and control, proof that, despite sanctions, war, or international isolation, Russia could move forward. The trains still ran. The steel still moved. But now, the steel is rusting, and the trains are still. And the very people tasked with keeping them moving are the ones documenting the system's breakdown in real time. Dozens of internal documents, maps of decommissioned supply routes, fuel allocation charts, and schedules of unpaid shifts have begun circulating in closed media spaces. Many of these files bear the stamp of official approval, until now hidden behind layers of state secrecy. It is not sabotage. It is exposure. And it's happening from within. In Kazan, a mid-level manager who once oversaw procurement for a regional maintenance division published a 17-page memo detailing precisely how funding for safety inspections was frozen in August, leading to a cascade of mechanical failures now affecting long-haul cargo trains across the Volga region. In Orenburg, retired workers returned to their former depots not out of protest, but to help younger staff prepare formal legal complaints, a process most had never imagined pursuing in a system where labor disputes are typically suppressed before they begin. And in St. Petersburg, a quiet but profound gesture, a group of current employees laid out rusted couplings and worn brake components in front of the local headquarters of Russian Railways, accompanied by a hand-lettered sign that read simply, "This is what loyalty built." Meanwhile, the company's internal structure is buckling under the pressure. Executive leadership has reportedly entered into a closed conflict with state regulators over access to emergency credit lines. According to sources inside the finance ministry, multiple attempts to secure emergency liquidity for key subdivisions have been rejected due to Russia's growing fiscal deficits. The Ministry of Economic Development, tasked with coordinating industrial resilience programs, has allegedly ceased all direct consultations with the company, referring future correspondence to the presidential administration, an unofficial admission that the crisis has outgrown the ministry's mandate. But no directive is forthcoming. No state decree, no televised address, no stabilizing gesture. Instead, responsibility is being passed downward. Executives are blaming regional directors. Regional directors are blaming local heads of operations. And those heads, left without resources or guidance, are facing their workers with nothing but vague promises and signed termination letters. At the same time, Russia's state media appears to be retreating from the subject altogether. Television coverage of infrastructure developments has quietly shifted from rail to road, with increased emphasis on automobile modernization projects and rural transit expansion, terms that insiders recognize as deliberate deflections. Not a single major outlet has run a dedicated segment on the railway layoffs. Even social media accounts once used to glorify the resilience of the transport sector have gone dormant or turned to unrelated topics. It's a silence that feels carefully engineered. But the void it leaves behind is rapidly being filled by independent sources, leaked footage, and first-hand worker testimonies. In the background, security services are watching with increasing concern. According to individuals familiar with internal FSB briefings, surveillance on major railway-linked telegram channels has intensified. Monitoring of industrial chat groups and union communication platforms is now a top priority. Yet despite increased pressure, the flow of information has not slowed. If anything, it has accelerated, now supported by sympathetic IT specialists within the system itself. This is no longer a case of disgruntled employees. It is a networked, informed, and highly organized class awakening to the political value of their collective knowledge. This awakening, however, is not being met with coordination from above. No centralized dialogue has been initiated. No representative of the federal government has agreed to meet union leaders. No emergency session of the Duma has been called. Instead, the Kremlin continues to frame the disruption as sectoral adjustment, offering vague indicators that the worst has passed, despite internal projections showing that at least 70% of non-critical freight routes may be suspended by the end of the month. Among workers, the language is changing fast. In local assemblies, men and women who once spoke in the language of repair and protocol now speak in the language of pressure points and leverage. Discussions are no longer about whether to protest, but how. Whether to strike openly or disrupt operations silently. Whether to appeal to state institutions or bypass them altogether. For a workforce that had, until now, accepted its place in a vertical system of power, the horizontal is beginning to emerge. Not in slogans, but in action. If you've been following this crisis with us, you already know this isn't just about jobs. It's about the slow detachment of one of Russia's most essential institutions from the control of the state. What comes next may not be revolution. But it will certainly not be repair. Not in the way Moscow once imagined. By the afternoon of October 24, it became evident that the crisis had moved beyond the realm of industrial malfunction and into a space that Moscow fears most, uncontrolled political tension in a systemically vital sector. While official state organs continued to downplay the scale of the disruption, the railway network itself had entered a state of partial paralysis. Key freight corridors connecting central Russia to both southern ports and eastern industrial hubs were no longer operating at capacity. Some weren't operating at all. The internal maps, once color-coded with flow indicators and transit velocity charts, had begun to bleed with red, delays, stoppages, cancellations. Not due to sabotage from outside, but abandonment from within. At least 3 regions, Kemerovo, Chelyabinsk, and Voronezh, have now issued internal alerts for logistical instability, a designation that permits local authorities to reallocate fuel, food, and labor reserves. These alerts, normally reserved for emergency weather conditions or wartime shortages, have never before been triggered in response to labor unrest. But the logic is now impossible to deny. Without a functioning railway system, entire regional economies grind to a halt. Factories cannot ship goods. Coal cannot reach power plants. Grain remains stranded in silos. And the officials left to answer for it are no longer the ones in Moscow. Governors and regional transport heads are now in open conflict with the federal center. According to several leaked transcripts reviewed by analysts, an emergency video session held earlier today between federal ministries and regional representatives erupted into visible disagreement. At least one governor demanded that Moscow either deliver financial relief or prepare for irreversible economic collapse within the week. Another questioned why wartime expenditures continued unchecked while internal logistics were disintegrating. No official minutes were released from this session. But those present described the tone as tense, fragmented, and, critically, without conclusion. Meanwhile, the workforce continues to reorganize itself in increasingly sophisticated ways. In Irkutsk, a newly formed regional council of railway engineers has begun coordinating with similar bodies in Tomsk, Barnaul, and Khabarovsk, exchanging detailed schedules of personnel suspensions, asset seizures, and equipment withdrawal. These communications are not ideological. They are technical, clinical, precise. But their implication is political. For the first time in modern Russian history, the industrial class is building horizontal channels of trust and verification across vast distances, independent of any union, party, or bureaucracy. The federal response to this emerging architecture of defiance has been uneven. In some regions, riot police have been quietly redeployed to guard infrastructure, a euphemism widely understood to mean worker intimidation. In others, regional prosecutors have begun issuing formal warnings against incitement to industrial sabotage, a legal term rarely applied outside of state security contexts. But the effectiveness of these tactics is already in question. In Nizhny Tagil, local security officers reportedly refused to detain a group of workers who had publicly threatened to obstruct cargo routes unless unpaid salaries were transferred by the end of the day. The officers, according to unverified but widely shared reports, responded simply, "We haven't been paid either." And this is where the crisis deepens into something more than structural decay. Russia's administrative vertical depends on the unquestioned obedience of its institutional base, not just soldiers or civil servants, but the vast machinery of technical labor that undergirds the nation's physical operations. Now, that obedience is no longer certain. And the question being whispered in regional offices and rail control centers alike is no longer, how do we fix this, but, what if we don't? Among Kremlin insiders, concern is mounting. The railway system has never been just a logistical platform, it is a symbol of centralization itself. From the imperial corridors of the Trans-Siberian Railway to the Soviet doctrine of mass industrial coordination, rail has represented Moscow's control over distance, over labor, over the rhythms of time and commerce. To lose control of it, even partially, is to admit vulnerability in the heart of the state's identity. And for a government that has built its legitimacy on projections of endurance, this vulnerability cannot be acknowledged. It must be hidden. Or ignored. But there is little left to conceal. Footage captured this afternoon from a control hub in Ufa showed rows of deactivated monitors and idle operators sitting motionless in their chairs. Not in protest, but in limbo. A local manager can be seen walking the floor, offering no instructions, only glancing repeatedly at a silent telephone. In Novosibirsk, a retired engineer gave an impromptu interview outside a shuttered repair hangar. "We built this country's movement," he said, "and now it stops, and no one even comes to explain why." The media blackout continues. With each passing hour, national television becomes more surreal, segments about foreign diplomacy, cultural festivals, agricultural fairs, anything but the paralyzed rail network threading across 11 time zones. The state has chosen absence over acknowledgement. But in the silence, something else is forming, not just anger, but coherence. In chat groups and break rooms, among technicians and station masters, a sense of shared clarity is emerging. The story they are now telling themselves is not about crisis. It is about abandonment. And abandoned people learn quickly to rely on each other. More alarming still for the central authorities is the tone of those discussions. There is no revolutionary language. No manifestos. No ideology. Only a growing awareness that power has evacuated the institutions it once claimed to protect. What remains is infrastructure without authority. Machines without leadership. and a workforce with nothing left to lose but its silence. This silence, increasingly, is breaking. And when it does, it won't look like a riot. It will look like a decision. Systemic. Distributed. Irreversible. Because what Moscow now faces is not just a logistical failure, or even a labor revolt. It is the slow disappearance of belief in the state's ability, or willingness, to provide the bare minimum it once promised. The illusion of managed control is cracking. And the sound it makes is no longer industrial. It is human. Relentless. And spreading. By the final hours of October 24, the crisis within Russia's railway sector had fully detached from the economic sphere and entered a zone that the Kremlin can neither manage nor predict, the quiet rebellion of institutional Russia. From the outside, Moscow still pretends to see nothing. No emergency legislation. No televised briefings. No presence in the headlines of the nation's state-run news. But within the fabric of the country, along the thousands of kilometers of track that once bound its industrial and political centers together, order is unspooling. Not in a dramatic burst, but in layers, slowly, deliberately, and without clear return. A senior operations manager in Kurgan reportedly left his office today after posting a public letter addressed to the presidential administration. In it, he described what he called a terminal decoupling between national narratives and ground-level operations. The letter made no demands. It asked no questions. It simply documented what had been lost: coordination, coherence, command. According to colleagues, he had worked for Russian railways since 1997. His departure was met not with resistance, but with quiet approval. Across multiple branches, long-serving employees are now disengaging themselves from what they describe as a collapsing structure without steering. The word management is no longer used as a reference to leadership. It has become a synonym for absence. And in this absence, the system is mutating. At logistics terminals in Ulyanovsk and Belgorod, workers have begun independently rationing access to fuel reserves, not under orders, but based on a regional algorithm shared anonymously through internal networks. In the southern depot of Armavir, shift supervisors are reportedly trading maintenance equipment and spare parts with neighboring divisions through informal barter channels. These actions are not acts of resistance. They are attempts to survive the void left by a vanishing command hierarchy. What began as a chain-of-command system has devolved into a mosaic of autonomous outposts, linked not by policy, but by urgency. In parallel, legal professionals embedded within industrial unions are now compiling formal appeals for international labor rights organizations, preparing documentation that outlines systematic violations of contract law, wage agreements, and housing provisions. These are not political appeals. They are technical in language, evidentiary in structure. But they carry a political weight that Moscow is no longer prepared to bear, the weight of proof. If these appeals gain visibility outside Russia's legal firewall, the narrative of domestic stability may fracture beyond repair. What's perhaps most critical, and most dangerous, is what's no longer being said. Across dozens of communication channels, one notices a striking linguistic shift. The language of protest, which once circled cautiously around euphemisms like frustration or disappointment, has now turned precise. Workers are naming names, citing dates, referencing clauses in long-ignored labor contracts and pointing to specific federal budgetary omissions. This is not rhetorical outrage. It is institutional memory reawakening. And it is being weaponized not in streets, but in spreadsheets, testimonies, and legal drafts. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the silence has grown heavier. Security officials continue to monitor developments with increasing agitation. According to two separate sources, senior FSB analysts now rate the railway sector as structurally unstable with high probability of escalatory potential. But internal documents reportedly caution against overt repression. There is no enemy to target. No headquarters to raid. No visible opposition to neutralize. The threat is infrastructural and psychological. And that makes it far more difficult to contain. For now, the Kremlin continues to lean on its most reliable strategy: avoidance. The illusion of calm is maintained through media choreography and bureaucratic inertia. But even this strategy is beginning to show fractures. In a rare misstep, a televised segment on state channel Rossiya 24 this afternoon featured footage from a thriving regional railway hub, only for viewers to quickly recognize it as archive footage from 2018. The backlash in social channels was immediate and brutal. "Even the trains are ghosts now," one viewer commented. The clip was quietly removed from all official platforms within hours. And while the propaganda machine stumbles, the public temperature rises. In major cities, where the ripple effects of halted cargo are now being felt in shortages and delivery delays, urban populations are beginning to ask questions that the state cannot easily answer. Why are supermarket chains adjusting schedules? Why are construction sites suspending work despite ongoing contracts? Why are so many rail-linked industrial parks suddenly quiet? The answers exist, but they are circulating outside the official channels, in a language the state no longer controls. By this point, the consequences are no longer hypothetical. Multiple sectors have entered a zone of attrition. Agricultural producers in the Volga region report losses in the tens of millions due to undelivered grain shipments. Chemical plants in Tatarstan are halting production not for lack of demand, but for lack of input materials stranded across the country. And the Ministry of Defense, one of Russian Railways' largest clients, is now forced to reroute certain military logistics through slower and more vulnerable overland alternatives. Even the war effort, once insulated from civilian breakdowns, is beginning to feel the drag of logistical implosion. But perhaps the most irreversible change is internal. A culture once defined by institutional loyalty is now defined by institutional loss. Those who kept the country moving no longer believe in the system that guided them. And while many are still at their posts, operating switches, monitoring freight, guarding depots, they are no longer doing so for the state. They are doing it for each other. For continuity. For the hope that something might survive the silence from above.